Hello and welcome to The Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. This week, I spoke to Mai Al-Nakib about her stunning novel, An Unlasting Home. It's an epic intergenerational saga that spans time and place, exploring the idea of home, belonging, and identity. With themes of birds and water running throughout, the book explores what happens when we leave our homes or are made to leave, and how sometimes places let us go themselves. We follow Sara, a university philosophy lecturer, as she finds herself accused of blasphemy, which has just been introduced as a capital crime punishable by death. As she navigates this impossibly difficult situation, she uncovers and explores the stories of the women who raised her and came before her, and how every moment led to right now. Mai Al-Nakib was born in Kuwait and spent the first 6 years of her life in London, Edinburgh, and St. Louis, Missouri. She holds a PhD in English Literature from Brown University and is Associate Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Kuwait University. Her academic research focuses on cultural politics in the Middle East, with a special emphasis on gender, cosmopolitanism, and postcolonial issues. Her short story collection, The Hidden Light of Objects, was published by Bloomsbury in 2014. It won the Edinburgh International Book Festival's 2014 First Book Award, the first collection of short stories to do so. Her debut novel is called An Unlasting Home and was published recently. Hi Mai, welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf. Thank you so much for joining us. And how are you today?
I'm doing really great, Samia. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so glad you're here. I'm so glad that we're going to get to talk about your absolutely stunning debut novel, An Unlasting Home. I think the thing that really drew me to it was that it's an intergenerational story. And I love intergenerational sagas. I think they're so fascinating because essentially it gives us a better understanding of the protagonist. If we also understand where they come from, as well as exploring the stories of other characters, it gives us such a holistic and deep understanding of our main protagonist. So I absolutely love it. And I think part of it is probably driven by my own curiosity about like where I come from and the people that came before me, and especially the women that came before me. So I'll stop talking, and I'd love to hand over to you to introduce your novel, please.
Absolutely. And I feel the same way as you do, by the way, about books. I mean, when I open up a book and I see family trees, I'm immediately drawn in. So, An Unlasting Home is, as you've said, a multi-generational saga that traces the lives of these 5 pretty formidable women across the Middle East, from India to Kuwait, Lebanon, Turkey, Iraq, and it spans the early 20th century into the 20th century till 2013, which is sort of the moment where the story begins. In 2013, Sara, who is the protagonist, of professor of philosophy at Kuwait University, is accused of blasphemy under a new law in Kuwait, making it capital crime. As she awaits trial, she starts looking back at her own life and tracing the stories of the women who have shaped her. So she starts to kind of she kind of excavates these stories that she was aware of, but also gathers together. So the stories of her grandmothers, Lulwa and Yasmin, and then the story of her mother, Noura, and the story of her beloved nanny or Aya, Maria. And then, we also get the stories of her great-grandmothers told through these other voices as well. So she in order to kind of come to terms with how she's arrived at this place, at this moment in her own life, but also in the history of her country, she traces their stories and so it's a kind of story of herself, her makeup, her genetic makeup through the women who made her, but also the story of her country, Kuwait.
Mm-hmm.
So
it explores a lot. So as you said, it explores the story and the history of Kuwait and the country, but it is also the story of five women and the lives that they lead and the families that they have and the falling in love that happened and the marriages and all of that as well, and also where they come from. And so like it's a lot. Like it's not just a single story. It's not just the case of Sara being accused of blasphemy and we don't just follow her because that I feel like is a heavy story in and of itself anyway. So how did you kind of piece the story together? What really inspired this particular kind of like mix of stories? Because it feels almost like kind of like a hot pot of different stories all merged together.
Yeah.
Where did that come from?
So after I finished my collection of short stories, The Hidden Light of Objects, I knew that I wanted to tell. First of all, I knew I wanted to write a novel. And I knew that I wanted to tell the story of women in this part of the world. I had this sense. And I also had a sense I wanted to tell a multi-generational story. I wanted it to be very different than the short stories, kind of teeming and expansive. And, that I had a sense of. And I had already started writing the stories of Lulwa and Yasmin. And in fact, I wrote them in the same way that they appear in the book, kind of moving back and forth between Lulwa's story, then I jumped to Yasmin, which was an interesting way to actually write it. But I enjoyed that. It's a kind of challenge, and it is in some ways almost shaped like each chapter is a kind of short story in a way, and it leaves you on a little bit of a cliffhanger, and then you connect back. Hopefully the reader doesn't forget, oh yeah, this is what happened to Lulu, and now I remember, and let me continue that storyline. But then and I was going back and forth. I did not really have a sense of how these two women's lives were going to connect. I didn't have a sense of where the story was going because I don't write that way anyway. I never have a sense in advance of where. I really enjoy that feeling of being lost in the story and the form, the uncertainty. I feel that's part of the exploration of writing for me, is trying to navigate this uncertainty. And then in 2013, this amendment was passed to a blasphemy law in Kuwait by a rather conservative parliament. And I was stunned, devastated to hear this news, that making blasphemy a capital crime. Capital crime is quite rare in Kuwait anyway. So this seemed like a real shift away from the Kuwait that I was more familiar with. Not that things were perfect by any means, but this seemed a rather extreme turn. And I really just felt so disempowered. And I just started thinking about what this would mean to me as a professor teaching at Kuwait University. The material that I teach could certainly be construed as blasphemous, And then what would this mean to the many activists that are doing work, the journalists? I mean, Kuwait, again, has a relatively free press. And what would this mean to critique, to challenge and to asking questions? All of this sort of really overwhelmed me that day that the news came down. I think it was really the very next day that I started writing the first Sara chapter, a version of which is the first chapter of the novel. Imagining putting myself in those shoes, which felt very, very real and very true, to myself, because that is what I was thinking about. And I think in some ways, when you're afraid of a situation, for me as a writer, one way to kind of tackle that is to just write about it. What would it mean if this actually happened? And I felt, that I really inhabited this persona, and it really hit me that, okay, this is the protagonist of the story, and that these women that I've already been writing about are her grandmothers. It just came together for me that same day. And then the story, kind of the novel, developed a shape and form that I took forward, over the years that it took to write.
Oh, yeah. I mean that sounds quite interesting. Almost like it was two separate things that kind of came together, which kind of makes sense with regards to what I was saying with how it is. So it feels like so many different stories almost in one. And yeah, I mean, I can completely understand that the actual kind of being told in Kuwait that this amendment was being passed. But you do tell us in the author's note that it was very quickly overturned. So it didn't last for very long, which meant that in practice, people were not massively impacted by it. But I can imagine just the fear of knowing that if something had come that far, almost at like the very last stage it was overturned, and it hadn't been overturned throughout the months it would have taken to go through Parliament or whatever the different processes are, is a really scary thought. Because then you think, well, if it very nearly happened then, it could well happen. If it doesn't happen tomorrow, it could well happen in 10 years from now. And what would the implications of that be? So I can imagine that was really frightening.
You nailed it. That's exactly right. The sense that once it happens, that opens a door in you that it can happen again. Once that door is opened, and once that thing, that something like that can happen once, there's no reason why it can't happen again. And, we swing back and forth in Kuwait, like many other places in the world, between a relative openness or a relative freedom, let's say, and then towards more conservatism. And we go back and forth. And, this can be frustrating because it moves at a slower rate than some of us would prefer. And that moment felt particularly, restrictive. And it stays with us. It still resonates, that it isn't so far away, I think, from my thinking and from the thinking of many, because you still have amendments that are passed to laws. And okay, they may not be as dramatic as capital punishment, but the, freedom of expression is restricted. There isn't. And again, it feels, especially for a writer, especially for a journalist or an academic, or I think just everyday people, this kind of cloud or shadow hanging over you, a sense that, you could get into trouble for something that you say, even if perhaps you didn't intend it to come out in that particular way. It can have implications that are frightening. They can be scary too. So yeah, that's absolutely right.
I'm really interested in actually almost like the landscape of how blasphemy laws kind of come up around the world, because there are states and countries in the world where it is illegal to do something that is blasphemous. And I think part of the issue is that the definition of blasphemy is so kind of vague or like open to interpretation, and that I think causes so many issues. And I think, I think like maybe in the West, there's a general idea that, blasphemy is taking the Lord's name in vain. I think that's the kind of, that's the understanding that I grew up with from like TV or like, common narratives, that that's what it means. So that's why you shouldn't add a swear word, or you shouldn't use it. You shouldn't use the Lord's name if you're in frustration, for example. I guess it means something a little bit different when it comes to like the Islamic law perspective. And I think blasphemy kind of means, associating partners with God and kind of implying that there is something other than God that is God-like, or, I think the definition is a little bit more complicated. But yeah, why do you think there is such an obsession sometimes when it comes to the issue of blasphemy? Because I feel like it's the reaction to people saying something that is blasphemous in certain parts of the world is very harsh. Where do you think that comes from?
That's a tough question. And I think probably the response in different places, emerge depending on what particular context, what is the context. So in Europe, responses to blasphemy, let's say a Muslim responses to a sense of that their religion is being blasphemed, are different than what we might have here, because there's a different circumstance. They're experiencing different forms of how people respond to their religion and who they are and their identities and so on. So it's a little bit different. I mean, to speak of Kuwait, my sense is it has less to do with religion than politics. That in a way it's more about, this is my take on it, deflecting attention away from some of the more serious issues that need to be dealt with and confronted. And this is a kind of easy diversion. Everybody will respond, to a question of blasphemy, or it's just, again, it sounds very dramatic and very high stakes. And this is our religion, and how dare anybody, but what that does drive attention away from is from the more serious things that need to be dealt with.
Mm.
And so I feel like sometimes, again, that's why I think that the religious pendulum swings back, the conservative, move towards religion swings back and forth, depending on what's going on politically and what it is that politicians want to draw people's attention away from. And religion becomes a very easy target or a kind of diversionary tactic.
Absolutely. I think it is something that can make people really charged and really
Exactly.
emotional and very passionate and almost very fixated, ignoring some of the other things that are going on. I think that is absolutely absolutely true, and unfortunately. But so throughout the book, not only do we follow the characters in their stories, but we get a real sense of the changing situation in Kuwait. I think understanding the history of Kuwait is increasingly important, I think. And it's just it feels like it's been so much turmoil and like upheaval, so much change over the last sort of 60 to 80 years, especially. And you write in the book about kind of the implications of the 1948 Nakba in Palestine, which then caused a lot of Palestinian refugees to come into Kuwait, but they helped like build the country. But then we also had the discovery of oil in 1938, but then later on we had the Iraqi invasion in 1990. Like a lot of change, a lot of pressure. I just wondered if you could just reflect on your understanding and your experience.
Okay, so that is a really great question and a complex one to unpack. But, the thing about Kuwait is, in many ways, it's this little country at a crossroads. And it's a place that can be easily overlooked in some ways, given its context and the countries that surround it and all the things that happen in those different places. And yet it has such a rich history, as you indicated in just those brief moments that you mentioned. And I wanted all of that history to inform what I was writing in An Unlasting Home. And in many ways, Kuwait and its history and its many layers and its complexities, its cosmopolitanism, all of that, which I find endlessly fascinating. All of that informs my writing. So it's in my short stories, it's in this novel, it's going to be in the one that I'm working on next. It's kind of there. And I feel like there are so many different areas to investigate when it comes to Kuwait's past. And one of the things that I find most, I mean, you mentioned, for example, the history of the Palestinians in Kuwait. And so from 1948, even before that, there were Palestinians that came to Kuwait, formed part of the community, helped to, as you said, build the modern state of Kuwait. And then there was this kind of second trauma that happened in 1991 for the Palestinians of having to leave the country, for a variety of reasons that we don't need to really discuss, but that were political and that were it was a real misstep in my opinion on the part of Kuwait. But it changed so much because the Palestinians had been a really intimate and intricate part of the nation state, especially in the field of education. So you remove this important community from the country, and then this has an incredible effect a catastrophic effect, I would say, especially on the system of education. And we're suffering the results of that now. So just this one example, of the complexity of the country and its makeup gives a sense of what it's kind of like. And you could speak of that in relation to oil, of course, the Iraqi invasion and its aftermath, something that I explore in the novel and in my collection of short stories as well, and the impact that has had environmentally, but on the makeup, on the psychology of the people, their sensibility, how it's changed, the demographic of the country, in part because of the loss of the Palestinians, but also other changes, all these incredible layers. And of course, the further back you go, the more layers that there are, so there's this history of trade in Kuwait, all of that informing. And of course, this is true of every place, no doubt. But I think Kuwait, because of its small size and because, again, as I said, its surrounding neighbors, tends to get overlooked. And I think I feel like the Gulf War, the war for the liberation of Kuwait, in many ways is the forgotten war. But it's the war that started everything else in a way that happened after that. The other wars that followed in the Gulf, the invasion of Iraq and all of that kind of started there. And I think that gets a little bit forgotten, overlooked, and it's interesting, So that's something that I've been, that's something I think that the story deals with. Although the novel is certainly not an overtly political book, or I think you can see it as historical fiction, but not in a didactic way. At least I hope not. It is very much about the story of this family, a story of this woman and these other women. But the political always affects the lives of the people in these places, and that is an important component, as does the history.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that there's that famous quote that is, the political is the personal. Like, I don't think there's a single place in the world where the personal lives are not impacted by politics, even from like the cost of living and the cost of a loaf of bread and a pint of milk to how the access to education and healthcare we have. Like, politics impacts every single strand of our life. And I think I really liked the fact that you provided so much context and so much backdrop, because it also comes through in terms of how people then behave, especially if they have witnessed suffering or loss or migration or forced migration. When you were writing the book, so obviously you've got the story of these people that is so informed by actual history. Like, you haven't fictionalized kind of the things that have been happening around the world. What was that process like in getting the balance right? Because as you said, like, you didn't want to write a history textbook to tell us what happened in Kuwait. You were writing your novel. How did you get that balance between the story and the characters and also portraying history accurately?
Yeah. I mean, yes, it was important for me to get many of the things right, but at the same time, I didn't allow myself to or I didn't allow the history or the need for accuracy to take over the importance of the kind of story that I wanted to tell about these human beings. So I think, and there were chunks of writing that were edited out, if I felt there were moments where I felt like, yeah, I sound a little bit like a history teacher here, that needs to go, that's just cut out because it doesn't work. You readers I don't think, I mean, at least the kind of reader that I am, I don't like to have that, it feels a little heavy-handed. So I was attentive to that as I was writing. I don't want to write that kind of story. I need to make sure that the history is woven in and that every element of the historical or political that I convey has some connection to something that's happening or one of the characters, and something that's relevant to their psychology, their makeup, whatever it is. So I really tried to be very attentive to that as I told those stories. So it's a historical novel, certainly, but not at the expense of being, a novel about these people's lives, and their particular story.
Good, that sounds really great. Just like kind of being clear in your mind that although you want it to be accurate, you never wanted that sort of history and that factual nature to overpower the story. And I'm so glad, because obviously, like, it's a great story and there are some really great characters. And on characters, actually, I want to talk a little bit about our protagonist, Sara, who is a philosophy lecturer, and that's how she gets caught. She gets in trouble because she's doing a lecture on Nietzsche, and one of her students makes a video of her quoting from Nietzsche's God is dead, and that's kind of, that she gets accused of blasphemy, and that's kind of where the story goes. Now, Sara is a really interesting character because Sara had spent so much time outside of Kuwait, but she made a decision to move back when her mother passed away. And in the book, I think what really comes out is that was a huge decision. Like, it was a big thing that she did. But I felt she had this really emotional pull once her mother had passed away, and then she kind of decided to look after her bookshop. And I think that's what helped her understand her own family history a little bit. But she also had her brother, Kareem, who had sworn blindly that he was never going to come back to Kuwait. He was really adamant, and he had encouraged Sara before as well, but throughout the book as well, he's been encouraging her that, you need to think about leaving. What for you really drove Sara's decision to move back.
At the very end. So the spoiler alert.
Yeah.
So Sara, in many ways, her decision, as you said, to return back to Kuwait was not an easy one for her to make. And in fact, I'm not sure that it was a decision that she fully understood. I think it was an instinctual decision. I have to come back here because Karim tells her at one point, "Why are you coming back now? You didn't come back when our mother was alive. What is drawing you back now? It doesn't make sense." And I think that rings true for me because I think in the midst of grief, we make decisions. And in fact, the chair of her department says that to her, is that don't make any decisions in the first year of grief because you're not thinking straight. And she gives up, as you've said, a lot. She gives up a partner that she's been with. I don't know how much of it, that was sacrifice that was because that wasn't working for her. But she gives up a really secure and wonderful job. She's doing great in her career. And it makes no sense that she returns back to this place that growing up, she was always split down the middle between the United States and Kuwait, between languages, between cultures. And she always wanted to go. Her heart belonged in the US, as did her mother's for that matter. And so it just doesn't make any sense. But she feels drawn. She comes back. And there are two people in her life that remain sort of there, which is her ayah, Maria, and her grandmother, Mama Yasmin. Everybody else is more or less gone, but these two people that really helped shape her are still there. And she comes back to Kuwait, and then I think she gets this new job, and then I think Sara is frozen for a period of time, or at least she feels herself to be a little bit stuck in place for about 11 years, which seems like a long time, but when you consider the many layers of trauma and grief that Sara has gone through in her life, 11 years is not that long. And in those 11 years, she collects the stories that have of her mother that she didn't know through Maria and through her grandmother, both of whom were sort of repositories for these stories of her other grandmother, because Yasmin and Lulwa, her grandmothers, were best friends, and Maria, who Noura was very close to. So there are all these stories that were there for Sara in a way to kind of get to know her own history, her own makeup, like how it is that she became who she was. So she didn't realize that to begin with. And at the same time, she's coming to terms with or reckoning with this Kuwait that she never felt that she quite belonged to anyway, but has been pulled back to. And Sara comes to kind of understand how Kuwait has arrived in where it is in a situation where blasphemy has become a capital crime. So she has to, and it's intricately connected, Kuwait's trajectory with the trajectory of these women in her family and her own family and herself. And at the end, I don't think it's so much that Sara has made the decision to leave, so much as Kuwait has let Sara go. Kuwait is no longer the place. I don't think Sara idealized Kuwait anyway. It was not a nostalgic looking for something that she'd lost for her. I don't think it was that at all, but more to kind of understand and come to terms with what was Kuwait, what is Kuwait now. And I think she realizes what Karim understood and what Karim had to understand all along is that this is not necessarily the place for you, not as it stands today. And so that's where I think she ends up. And she's okay with it. She wasn't okay with it for the 11 and a half years that she was there after her return. But by the end of this kind of dilemma, this sort of experience of going through the trial, waiting for the trial, and then all the work that she has been doing for those 11 years, collecting the stories, she begins to understand, well, wait a minute, these women, they made it possible for me to let place go and become something else. They did it for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that, actually, the title of the book is called An Unlasting Home. Now, I find it really interesting because you could have used any word. You could have said like a changing home, a home that no longer is, or whatever. Like you could have used any word to explain this question of what is home do we ever return home? But you chose the word unlasting. Why?
Well, the story of the title is an interesting story. I had a working title for a very long time. The whole period that I was convinced that this other title was the title of the book. And then my editor was adamant that this was not the title for the book, and that in fact I had to go back and look for a different kind of title. And I spent weeks thinking. I think I had hundreds of titles, and I'm sure some of the ones that you listed might have been on that list too. And then what happened, of course, in the middle of the night, very unexpectedly, I remember Joyce. So one thing, I'm sure that the trope of birds runs through this story, and in fact, it's on the cover. And that was very important to me. And in fact, the original title had the word birds in it. And I was just racking my brain, anything to do with birds. It just, nothing was working. And then I remembered Joyce. And Joyce, the trope of birds runs through all of his work. And I was, from when I was a young kid, Joyce had always been very important to me. But it had never I never made the connection until, again, late in the evening, towards when that title was very much due. I picked up Portrait of the Artist and I started flipping through it, and I found underlined, this particular quote, which is a beautiful quote, for they were birds. Then he had to go away. I'm sure I'm going to misquote it. Then they had to go away, for they were birds. Then he had to go away, for they were birds ever going and coming, building ever an unlasting home under the eaves of men, ever leaving the homes they had built to wander. And I just thought how absolutely perfect. These women are birds, and they are birds that build these homes, and literally under the eaves of men's houses, often because they are connected to these men. And then they have to leave those homes. And it's not often a kind of, sometimes they don't have a choice that their departures, for their departures, but those departures can bring something to them. They find something important to their lives in their migration, in their movement away. And so this idea of the unlasting home may sound or may have a negative connotation, but for me it didn't. And that's why, and I think for Joyce in that quote, it doesn't either. There is something very empowering, very something that is almost creative about this notion of the unlasting. And that I wanted to convey in the title because it was true for the women characters.
Yeah, I mean, so the word unlasting obviously it means something that doesn't last. And that can mean because it's got a deadline. For example, you're living in Kuwait on a work permit visa. I don't know what the right word is, and so you've only got a visa for 2 years or for 5 years, and after 5 years you have to leave. So in that sense, Kuwait or wherever it is would have been an unlasting home. But just thinking about the quote that you hearing you say that quote, it's made me think about how actually everything is an unlasting home in relation to how we grow, because we outgrow spaces and we outgrow places. But not just that, I think you can still live in the same neighborhood and your home be different, and you can even live in the same house and the house be different because it all changes, but it reflects also how you change and how you grow. And I remember when I left home for university, and obviously I only left temporarily at that age, but when I graduated, I had this real feeling that I hadn't come back home. Everything had just changed so massively. And I think that a lot of my peers also had that same sense. And although I did continue to live with my parents for the next 5 years, maybe, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 years, I think I continued to live with them, and I was working in London. But I still had this very real sense that it had just changed so much. My relation to home was just so different, and I felt at that point that I needed to find a new home. It kind of, I kind of felt like my wings were clipped, and I needed to just let them go. So yeah, I just think it's such a fantastic
it's a universal experience, this, and it's again, I don't want to romanticize it, because that that point that you made a lot, it's funny because a lot of readers here in Kuwait, non-Kuwaiti residents, have said to me, this is exactly how we think about Kuwait, as an unlasting home. And of course, that's tinged with sadness, with anxiety, with a sense of insecurity. So those are, that kind of experience of movement, of migration, of immigration, of being a refugee, right? That experience of a home being unlasting is fraught with peril, with sadness, with real trauma, with danger. And then moving, the experience of migration and moving to a new place can be, you're displaced, it can be dehumanizing, you're classified as an outsider and an other. Those are all experiences of an unlasting home that should not be understated or trivialized. Absolutely not. At the same time, even sometimes in the difficulty of movement, we can find spaces of transformation, of surprise, of power or empowerment that comes in the navigation of a new context, a new location. I think the experience, as you said, of getting older is the experience of being in or inhabiting an unlasting home for all of us. So, as we get older, we look outside our window, even if we have not moved, we feel dislocated. And I think that that's true of, Sara is, in her 40s or in her early 40s, but this is a point, a kind of pivotal point of also assessing where you're located. What is this the life that you want to continue living? We often think of that as part of our adolescence. When we're an adolescent, everything's changing, and this, you're becoming an adult, and you're, pushing back against your parents and against convention and all of that. But I think also people don't consider that this is something that happens also in middle age, in your 40s, in your 50s, and I think for women, I don't want to say especially, but women do experience this. The children have grown, and their parents are older, and you have the sense of who am I exactly? And what is it that I want to do in my life? And is the path that I've been on for all these years the one that I want to continue on? And then again, the home becomes unlasting. And I think that can be, you can see it as a negative thing, and you can lament it, or see it as something I think the ending of the novel, I think for me, at least, it feels like a kind of positive move. It's a little bit uncertain. We don't know exactly what's going to happen, but I think the final words of the novel give it a kind of more positive tinge.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it definitely ends on positivity for sure. And yeah, and I mean, I thought it was really interesting what you said about how kind of like refugees and those fleeing war and in those kind of very difficult circumstances, those are also unlasting homes. That isn't something that should be romanticized, because that is really, really awful. But one of the other things that it made me think about was that even in places like Kuwait, and I think this is true to other places around the world as well, you can live in a place for decades and generations and never fully belong. And I think part of belonging somewhere is about having a level of security and stability, whether that is like being given a passport or like citizenship or whatever it may be. But I think although those are just words and labels, they're really important in grounding you and making you feel stable, and also reflecting the opportunities that you have and the freedom of movement, etc. But my understanding about Kuwait, especially, I don't know if this is still true, but in order to be given, I don't know if it's like citizenship or whatever it is, but you have to prove ancestry in 1920, which is a long time ago. But if you had moved in, say, 1940, that's still 2-3 generations from today. So somebody could be living there whose grandmother moved in 1940, for example, or 1950, but I'm never going to have that fixed stability. And I just can't imagine what that must do to a person. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on that, if you had any experience.
I mean, it's horrific. So for me, that situation, the situation of citizenship in Kuwait, which is something that I've written about in my academic work, is frankly horrific. That there's these are arbitrary decisions, that governments put in place, 1920 or versus 1940 versus you have to prove this or prove that. as far as I'm concerned, if people are in the country and they've been in the country and they have jobs and they're working and they're contributing, they're loyal, they feel that it's home, they have children, they have grandchildren, that's enough proof that you're part of the community. If the country needs them to be there, because many of them are there doing jobs that the country needs and wants them to do, then for all intents and purposes, they're Kuwaiti. They should be Kuwaiti. We have so many stories of so you have the Bedouin population, which are the stateless, who have been in Kuwait, who've been, again, part of the community, grandchildren, the people that have their grandchildren here, and even further back, who've been part of the army, the police, all of these things, are absolutely connected to the community, and who are not given citizenship. This is untenable and unethical. Non-Kuwaiti residents, some of whom have, again, people like Maria, who've spent so many years in the country raising other people's children, sometimes 40, sometimes 50, sometimes 60 years and beyond in the country, and not given citizenship. It's not even a consideration. I think, again, is an extremely unethical decision and not good for the country, because one has to think about, when we consider, or when we structure citizenship in this insider outsider way, you belong, you don't belong, you're allowed, you're not allowed, you're entitled, you're not entitled, this creates divisions and splits in the country that have ramifications that are very, very frightening. And I think we see these divisions where with the rise of xenophobia and resident sentiment, it is not going to be good for the country in the long run. That is not the kind of country that you want to create, to construct. And, this is something that has bothered me for a very, very long time. There are other people who write about it as well. And I think it is a real problem. And in that sense, there's nothing romantic at all about An Unlasting Home. Maria, one of the reasons that Sara comes back is that she says that Maria needs to put her on her sponsorship, on her kafala, so that, that she's going to have no one else. So if she doesn't put her on her kafala, Sara's kafala or sponsorship legally, Maria will have to leave, even though she's been in Kuwait for all these decades. I mean, for me, that is just unspeakable.
It's really, really horrific, really sad, and also really frightening as well. And I can't imagine what it must feel like to be somebody that is living in any place, and you've built your life, you've got friends and family, and you've been working, but to have this idea that, well, the state still thinks that I don't belong. I just can't imagine how awful that must be. But it is the lived reality for many people as well.
And this idea that, sorry to interrupt, Samia, but this idea that, and once I'm done working, I have to go home. Only that place is no longer necessarily home, right? Just like for Sara, in a way, coming back from the States, although even in the States, Sara didn't feel it to be home. And then she comes back, and then she doesn't feel that quite to be home, although of course she has many privileges that the residents that we're speaking about don't enjoy. So it's the same is true for people who work in Kuwait on a working visa, and then eventually they have to go home. But this place, if they've been in Kuwait for 60 years, is their home. And again, I think it's a really it's difficult and unfortunate situation that I think should be remedied the world over. Kuwait's not the only place, and I think there's just it's just such a dehumanizing. These are dehumanizing laws, and they're not good for any society, because what they end up constructing is a society that is exclusionary, and that is not really a recipe for democracy, for diversity, for any of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just, I mean, it is really, really horrific, especially I think if you are maybe even in the shorter term, if you're working somewhere and you know that within a certain period you have to leave, that kind of uncertainty, and it's not necessarily your decision, and you know that I can't have a 6-month buffer while I figure things out, I have to leave at the end of my contract. That kind of uncertainty is really difficult. And I think, we do have a glamorizing of the the travel life, being able to explore the world. I kind of feel like that is downplaying the importance of still having somewhere or bits of places that you can call home, but also have the stability and the security of knowing that this is somewhere that you're not going to be asked to leave. You're not going to have the immigration forces knocking on your door at 3 a.m, which happens to a lot of people. So just really, I really love that exploration generally, and I'm so glad that it was done throughout the book. And I think all of the characters experience that idea of where is home, and can we ever go back, and do we ever go back, and what do you do when you go back and it's so different and you don't feel, this doesn't feel like home anymore. But one of the other things, you mentioned that there is a theme of birds, but there's also a theme of water throughout the book, which I really loved and I find really interesting. I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So the water comes from the movement across the Indian Ocean. So just that movement, because of the trade that existed between Kuwait, the Gulf, and India, and of course the connection between Kuwait and India through the characters, but also obviously through the movement of ships across the water back and forth. So there's a lot of that. There's a mention of the boats, the type of boats in the book, and I think that was important in that specific historical sense. But also the idea of the movement across the water is it reflects or kind of mirrors, I think, the movement of birds back and forth through the sky. So you have that kind of movement trope both across water and across the skies that I wanted to express. The experience of reading the novel, I also thought about as a movement across water. So in the beginning, you're kind of thrown in to the event that happens to Sara, and then you move to Lulua, and then you move back to Sara, and then you move to Yasmin, and then back to Sara. So there is this kind of ebbing and flowing between the characters. And I think I had a very conscious sense of this mimicking the movement of the waves, and that I wanted the reader to trust me, I guess, as the writer, or to trust the text, trust the story, that movement would in the end be worth it. Because, when you're tossed across the seas, there's a kind of nausea that you feel. There's a sense of being overwhelmed by the experience of it and the movement. And I think a little bit the story does that. Like you said at the very beginning, there are many characters, there are many places, but in that back and forth, there's a kind of lulling, I think, as well, and that you do get captured by these characters, and that you do get to know who they are. You aren't then, hopefully, fingers crossed, by the end, not confused by what they're doing, who they are, and all of that. So I did feel there was a connection there between the form itself and the idea of water and the idea of the sea.
Oh, I really love that. Obviously I hadn't thought about the form in terms of water, but that's such a really lovely way to think about it, and it makes complete sense, because there is, especially because we are kind of like flowing between places and even between time as well.
Exactly.
It's just really lovely, and I love water metaphors in general. And I think I was thinking about it while reading the book, especially with like Baba Mubarak, who kind of had this idea of the life that he wanted for his children. And I think water can really help with understanding that kind of, you may want a certain life for yourself or for somebody else, but actually life is going to take its course, and people are, they're their own, especially when it comes to like your children, like your children are their own people. So no matter what you may want for them, they should be able to live life in accordance to who they want to be. Kind of like water, like you can only go so far in directing a stream in a certain direction, right? It's still gonna go its route, and the waves are gonna be as big as it's gonna be. It's its own form. And I really liked that kind of, like we talk about going with the flow, and that flow is essentially like the flow of water, right?
It is exactly. And also, you can direct, as you said, you can direct the flow only so much, because for many of those characters, Baba Mbarak didn't want to return to Kuwait. Lulwa certainly didn't want to. Noura didn't want to return to Kuwait either. And Maria, I'm sure that if she had her choice, she would have never left Goa to go to Pune first and to go to Kuwait. But the water takes you, so, and as what you said about parents and sort of in a way cultivating, it's almost cliche, that they try to cultivate their children are their seeds, and that they're trying to prepare the conditions for them to grow, and they do most parents do the best that they can for their kids, and then, as you've said, sometimes the best plans fail, and sometimes that's because the children themselves go in different directions, as they should, and they should follow whatever it is that they want to follow for themselves. But also sometimes life gets in the way, terrible things happen, or good things, but just take them on a completely different into a different stream, as you said, so I do think that that's all there, as you've said, in the metaphor of water.
So I obviously have loved your book, and you also have a short story collection. Did you always want to be a writer? Like, did you always know that this is something that you were going to do?
I did. I think for me, it's when I figured out, because I was a voracious reader as a kid, and when I figured out that, oh, well, these stories that I love reading are written, then it was at that point that I was like, that is the thing that I want to do, and I started keeping a diary at a very young age, and I fell in love with words. I was just sort of obsessed with words, with language, with writing things down. And I always had the sense that that is what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a writer. But in Kuwait, when I was growing up, there wasn't really a sense of writing is a vocation. Writing is something that you can do. There was just no sense of that at all for me. At least I didn't have that sense. And I think that that's true in general. So writers in Kuwait that would write in Arabic were either, they were journalists, or they had other jobs, and they were writing part-time. I think that's true in the Middle East in general. At that time, certainly. And so the closest thing to becoming a writer for me was to study literature. And so then I took this, as you said, a kind of completely different stream, because studying literature is not the same as writing literature. Although I have no regrets, in a sense, although in a way it meant that I became a writer later. My path was slower, and if I had jumped into a creative writing program, as a lot of young people do today, maybe I would have produced something faster at a younger age. But the study of literature, doing my undergraduate, my master's, my PhD, that all takes time, and it isn't the same as writing it. I kept writing, but I was doing different kinds of writing than this sort of telling stories and so on. That wasn't exactly the kind of writing I was doing. And it was after I got my PhD, really, and I don't think it's a coincidence, that I could turn to the thing that I wanted to do all along since I was a kid, which is write fiction. But I have no regrets, because I really feel that the time that I took studying literature, involved in literature, involved in the theoretical material that I love so much, the writers that have shaped me, the philosophers and literary theorists, have turned me into the writer that I am. And I don't think in my 20s I could have written The Hidden Light of Objects. I just don't think that would have been possible. So I think it was a circuitous route, but I've arrived at where I always wanted to be in a way.
Yeah. Oh, that's so brilliant. And actually, on fiction, I also read a lot. I read a lot, but I love a fiction. And I remember went through a phase, maybe when I was at university, where I kind of felt like, oh, maybe I shouldn't read too much fiction. I need to have all the knowledge. I'm just going to read lots of nonfiction. But now I read fiction a lot. I probably read about 80% of what I read is fiction. And especially now, there's so many new voices and so much interesting historical fiction, and I feel like it's giving a voice to so many stories that have been previously hidden, in a way that we don't get that with memoirs even, or textbooks. And yeah, I just wondered as well, what what is it that makes you want to write fiction?
So I love what you said there, because in fiction, there's a kind of truth that you can arrive at. And I don't believe in any single truth, obviously, but the writer's particular version of truth that they're trying to convey to you or through their writing, that I think is really singular and interesting. There's something about the way fiction conveys these points of view and these experiences and these takes on the world. And as you said, history, unheard of, unseen histories, unseen experiences, that I think is so particular to fiction, that draws you in as a reader, that's quite different than any other form. So I think the value of fiction and the value of literature is really undeniable. And I too am drawn. I mean, I read all kinds of things, but certainly for me, the majority of what I read is fiction. I think that the reason I want to write fiction, and that I was always sort of obsessed with the idea that I wanted to write fiction, was because it's precisely that. The worlds that fiction can create, that I myself as a reader have been so seduced by, that have changed who I am, really changed me in ways. Sometimes you encounter a book and you read it and you're different at the end of that book than you were at the start of it. And as it turns out, writing is the same experience. Writing a book, I am not the same person that I was at the start of An Unlasting Home. I wasn't at the end of Hidden Light. I wasn't the same. I changed. And for me, as a writer, that is the most rewarding experience. And it's just so exciting to know that you can transform yourself through writing, and in ways you can't predict, and you don't set out to do. It just happens. And the same is true of reading fiction. So I think that's what draws me most to writing fiction. I think academic writing, which I do as well, can do the same. Certainly it can do the same, but I am drawn also to the style of fiction, what language does stylistically, and how that shifts your sense of the world, your perception of the world, in a way that's a little bit different than academic writing, or nonfiction writing, even memoir. I think these are all powerful and viable forms, certainly, but for me, it's fiction that does it the most, in the way that resonates the most.
Yeah, because I think, it's important to remember that An Unlasting Home in 2013, where it's set, is actually a fictionalized point in history, because that point was never reached in 2013 in Kuwait because the amendment was overturned. But that's a fictionalized place, time in history. But it's also like, it's not like in a new world. Like it's still in Kuwait as we know it. So it's a really interesting time, because what that enabled us to do, you didn't show everything that was impacted by this potential blasphemy law. But what it did is, what it can do is, it has forced readers and people in general to really think about what could have happened, and therefore what may happen if something like this was to happen in the future. And I just think that is so powerful, because also sometimes it just creates space for us to think about things that sometimes go unsaid or cannot easily be said because of various reasons. And yeah, I just think it's so powerful.
I think it speaks to the present. This idea of the idea of thinking about the past or revisiting the past is not done, for me at least, not for reasons of nostalgia or sort of, oh, look at this wonderful time, but rather to consider how that shapes the present and how it can speak to the future. And then, of course, these questions are very much alive in the United States now, where you have books being banned and freedom of expression being restricted for all kinds of reasons, some of them religious. So, I mean, it isn't a moment fixed in time in 2013, but rather very much related to the present, whether here in Kuwait or in other parts of the world as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. May, it has been honestly so incredible speaking to you. I have loved it. Just quickly as we end, is there something, you have mentioned you are working on something. Can you share any details about your next piece of work?
Sure.
What can we expect from you?
Thank you. Yes, Samia, it's been an absolute delight for me as well. But I am working on a novel, and it is, what I can tell you is that it's set on the island of Failaka, which is a Kuwaiti island that has been inhabited since the Bronze Age. It was inhabited during the time of Alexander the Great, and was inhabited by Kuwaitis until the invasion in 1990. And it's an incredibly fascinating place. I've always been a little obsessed with it, and so it's a great place to set this new story, which is set a little bit in the future, maybe 10 to 15 years into the future, and it's going to be considering, you know, some of the characters that come back to this island and revisit it. So part of the story is born of the place itself, Failaka, so it gives me an opportunity to live in it in my mind anyway, for a few years. So yeah.
Wow. I mean, that sounds incredible. I'll definitely be keeping my eyes and ears open. I cannot wait to hear more about that, and the best of luck with it. And thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much, Samia. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much, Mai, for your time today. That was such a warm and moving conversation. I really loved it, and I hope that you, my listeners, did too. If you enjoyed the podcast, please follow the Diverse Bookshelf on your podcast platform of choice and connect with me on social media. I would really appreciate it if you could rate and leave a review, as it helps more people find the podcast.